readers. Welcome to Books Connect Us from Penguin Random House. This is a podcast about staying connected with each other and the stories and authors who inspire us. Andrew Child is the author of thrillers such as Too Close to Home and Invisible. Andrew is now embarking on his highest profile work yet, teaming up with his brother, Lee Child, to co-write the newest entry in the incredibly popular Jack Reacher series, entitled The Sentinel. In The Sentinel, Jack Reacher finds himself battling bad guys in the murderous world of cybercrime. Let's join Pat Stango as he talks to Andrew Child about working with his famous older brother and what it's like to write one of literature's most enduring heroes.
So our guest today is Andrew Child, a prolific and popular author who for the first time is teaming up with his brother Lee Child to collaborate on the latest entry in the very popular Jack Reacher series. The new book is entitled The Sentinel, and it's on sale now. So let's welcome our guest, Andrew Child. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks very much for having me as a guest. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so Andrew, things must be an exciting time. The book, The Sentinel, is coming out right now. So how are you doing? How are you handling the big book release?
Yeah, it's always an exciting time. It doesn't matter how many books you've written. When a new book comes out, it's really exciting. You spend a lot of time working on a book, and at the beginning it's just thoughts in your head, and then it's words on the page, and when you finally get to hold the finished product in your hand, it's a wonderful moment. So then when you're heading in towards the launch, you've got all that excitement, but there's also a degree of nervousness because you obviously hope people are going to like the book, and until it's out there on the shelves and until it's in people's hands, you don't know how they're going to respond. So it's exciting, and it's mixed with a little bit of nerves. And of course, this is the first time I've been involved with a book launch during a pandemic. And so none of the normal things that we usually do are possible. Normally you'll be going to bookstores and actually meeting people and talking to them, which is great after you've been cocooned away in your spare room for 9 months or however long it was while you were frantically typing away. So it's a strange experience, this one, because I'm missing that personal contact that you normally have at launch time.
How has there been anything that you're able to do? Are you doing like these? A lot of authors are doing virtual events and things over Zoom. Have you managed to regain some of the normalcy of a book launch in this time?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Zoom has been huge because we've got quite a few virtual launch events lined up for the week that the book comes out, which will be great. We've done a few already with book clubs and lots of podcast recordings and interviews via Zoom. So we're doing everything we can to be as normal as possible. And of course, in some ways, there are some advantages because there might be people who, due to geography or because they're busy working or whatever, can't necessarily make it to a bookstore. So there are some ways in which Zoom has that much more universal reach than a physical event. So, we're trying to look for the opportunities and look for the upsides to offset. I think it's just, you're used to the routine and the ritual of launch week, and anytime anything's a little bit different, it takes a little while to get used to, but I'm sure that we'll be able to find some positives and capitalize on those.
Well, this book in particular must be also such a different experience for you because you obviously have a great career writing your own books and your own thrillers up to this point, but this one is such a unique experience because you've written with your brother Lee Child the newest entry in the super popular Jack Reacher series. So I guess first off, how did that even come about? How did that opportunity come about? Were you guys at a family barbecue and then over hamburgers you end up deciding to write the newest Jack Reacher book together? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's the strangest thing. It's not something that I had anticipated or, ever would have imagined happening. But the way it unfolded was that I had the latest book in the Paul McGrath Janitor series was coming out. So as we were just sort of touching on, the normal routine of book launches and so on. So as you probably know, Lee and I both live in Wyoming now. So on the day that my book came out, we were going to go down to the Tattered Cover in Denver for an event. So we drove down together, and it was a horrendous day. It was January. It was snowing. It was really difficult driving to get down there. So really, I was just completely focused on either driving or thinking about the event. What are you going to say? Are you going to make a fool of yourself? Are you going to trip over your feet on the way to the stage? All that stuff. So I had nothing else in my mind other than getting to Denver in one piece and trying to do a good event. So then when we'd finished and we were driving back again, Lee broached the subject. And I mean, I was just floored because, Reacher is his creation. Reacher is a global phenomenon and it's his legacy. And the idea that he would let anybody take that over, it had never even crossed my mind. But the way he explained it was that, he had written 24 books by this point. And when he started, and I remember this because I remember him saying it at the time, he said that he obviously hoped that Reacher would turn into a long-running series, but that he made a promise to himself and by extension to the readers that he would only ever give it 100%. He would never get to the point, as you sometimes see with a long-running series, where the author's just phoning it in. And he got to his 24th book, and he was looking at himself and saying, well, given that he'd been doing it for a long time, how much longer could he keep going? And he figured he probably had another 2 or 3 books in him. And after that, he was just going to have to stop. But he was also torn by the fact that he knew that his readers wanted more Reacher. They love Reacher, and they look forward every year to the latest installment, seeing what Jack has been up to, what trouble he's got into, and how he's dealt with it. So he was really torn between these two opposing forces, the need to retire, but also the obligation to continue. So one day he said that he had this experience that was almost like a kind of weird dream where he thought, well, the only way out of this is for me to wake up 15 years younger, more energetic, still full of ideas and full of passion. And he thought, well, obviously that's not possible. But then he thought, well, what about my brother Andrew? He's 15 years younger, and so that's where the idea came from. So when he asked me about it, at first, as I say, I was just floored by it. I was flattered, honestly, that he would even consider me for it. And then my next thought was, well, could I do it? Because, talk about huge shoes to fill. So, I had to think about it long and hard, but I think that, the key to my decision was what he was saying about the fans, because, there are an awful lot of Reacher fans out there in the world, but I was the first. I was the first person to read Killing the Floor. And this was back when his whole livelihood was, and of him and his family was hanging on whether Killing the Floor would succeed, because he'd lost his job, he had no money, and if this book didn't sell, he was doomed. And so he gave it to me to read, and I was a big thriller reader, always have been. So I had a good sense of what a good thriller looked like. So I was terrified because I thought, A, what if it's not any good? How am I going to tell my big brother? And B, what would that mean for him and his family? They would starve. So obviously it was a huge relief to find out that the book was so brilliant. But what also I remember about reading it is, as you probably remember, it's written in the first person. And so the way the story unfolds, Reacher gets arrested in the diner and then taken up to the police station and questioned. So you're quite a long way into the story before you learn his name. But even before I knew Reacher's name, I knew Reacher. Mm-hmm. Lee and I, we are brothers. We have the same DNA, and I knew Reacher. I knew how he would respond. I knew what his motivations were. I knew what was important to him. And so, this was somebody I felt intimately connected to even before I knew his name. And this continued year after year with each new book that was written. And we would talk about him while he was writing them. And there were all kinds of funny little connections, like the name of the villain in one of the books was actually one that my daughter suggested, and he liked the name and adopted it. And, the title for one of the books was something that I suggested that he liked. So, there are all kinds of connections along the way But
So it's always been a family affair to some degree.
exactly, he put it almost like, Reacher was an extra brother, that we were both connected to. So, in the end, I decided, okay, yeah, there's a risk of a catastrophic failure, but I've always been the kind of person that would rather try something and risk failing than not try it at all. Somebody once told me that the two saddest words in the English language are "what if." And I never want to be in a position where I look back and say, well, what if I'd tried writing Reacher? I thought I'd rather go for it. So, you've seen the result, and I hope that people are happy with it.
Well, yeah, do you feel, I'm sure there was a lot of pressure starting that process, the writing process, but now that the book is, it's just going out to readers now, but it's done, the quality of it. Do you feel a little bit of a sense of relief that, the book is done and you could feel confident we didn't screw it up? I didn't come in and write help write the first bad Jack Reacher book.
I know, wouldn't that be awful? Yeah. And that's one of the hardest things to judge, because when you're writing a book, you're so close to it. You've lived with it every minute of every day for months and months and months. And it really does get difficult to have any kind of an objective opinion as to whether it's any good or not. So that's where it was an interesting experience writing with someone else, because I've never done that before. And that's also where your editors come into play. We were extremely fortunate because we had fantastic editors, both in New York and in London. So we had, the best possible team helping us along. So you've got hopefully you derive some confidence from their reaction. And then within the publishing houses, their first readers, you have their reactions. My wife, Tasha, who's also a novelist, she is always my first reader. So, and she would tell me if there was anything to worry about. She was very enthusiastic and supportive. So, all of the indications were there. But, I think there's something about being an author. You're always sort of having to prove yourself all over again. It doesn't matter how good any of your previous books were. This is the one that so you're staking everything on each new book. So, at the end of it, though, when we stepped back and thought about it, I think the biggest reassurance for me was the fact that Lee was happy with it, because he's the ultimate judge of Reacher, and he was happy. He felt it had everything that it needed, and so I'm hopeful that the people whose opinion, the only one that really counts are the readers. So I'm hoping that they are going to agree and with Lee and with the editors and the early readers. Fortunately, the first early reviews that have come through are very favourable too. So I'm hoping that the people who really count, the readers, are gonna say the same thing.
That's great. So how was the process? And I guess something that probably a lot of people would want to know, since it's two brothers writing a book together, and especially a character as tough as Reacher. How were arguments in the writing room settled? How did or were there any, or did you feel like you both were on the same page through the whole process?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there were any arguments at all, honestly. We started out, and the pandemic obviously played a part, because when we started out, we are next but one neighbors, but since we're in Wyoming, that means that's 3.5 miles apart. So he would typically come over to my place. I have an office in the basement, and we would sit around and we would throw ideas around about, what kind of things might happen, and where the book should be set and what the tone should be like, and so on. And so we've done a lot of that stuff before the pandemic hit. We were very much, we were sort of filling the tank with ideas and inspirations, and we were pretty much ready to go when everything went completely crazy. It's in fact, the way that the process works is that oftentimes the publisher likes to put the opening chapter of a new book in the paperback of the previous book. So, the beginning of the book was already written before Christmas, because they needed that for putting in the back of Blue Moon. So we were already well on the path when the pandemic started. And then after that, we moved more to kind of communicating, mainly sort of text back and forth, sometimes phone calls, occasionally Zooms. But, we had to make it more remote, because I'd traveled a bit in England, Lee had been to New York, so we had to be careful about isolating for the relevant periods. So then it became a little more remote. So I wouldn't say that at any point during the process we had an argument at all. But the thing that I found the most difficult to adjust to was with my previous books. I'm not exactly a detailed outliner, but I did always have more of a sense of where the story was going than Lee ever does. So there would be times where I was feeling a little exposed because I would feel like we were at the end of the story that we had mapped out and I didn't know what was happening next. And that would make me feel a bit anxious. So I would call Lee and say, so what happens next? And he'd say, well, I don't know. Because, that's just his way of working. And for him, it was nothing to worry about because he's done it that way 24 times before and it's always worked well. So, he was totally calm and relaxed about it. And I think I was getting a little more like, well, we need to know what's going to happen. What's going to happen? He was like, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. And, we did figure it out. And what I learned from it was there were times, particularly with this separation that was imposed by the pandemic, where I started to try to plan a little more ahead. I had there are two distinct, long, detailed scenes that I worked out for different parts of the book. And neither of them actually worked at all. They didn't get included. Not a single word of them got included because not the location was different, the action was different, the people involved were different, because for some reason, it just does not work to try to plan or outline or reach a book. You need that spontaneity that every single point in the book where there's a decision that either Reacher makes or the villains make, it has to be made in that moment to make it that sort of spontaneous, organic, surprising direction to take. So, I'm hoping that I'll be able to try, carry that sort of learning experience forward into the next book because, that was the biggest adjustment for me to make. So, if I can learn from the experience, that will make my life a lot easier.
You can't tell Reacher what to do. He's gonna do his own thing. So in this novel, The Sentinel, Reacher's trying to mind his own business as usual, and then he ends up saving a character who turns out to be this sort of like, I don't want to say dweeby, but like, mousy, a little bit hapless IT manager named Rusty Rutherford. And so I wanted to know what was, because I really like the dynamic between them. So what was the thinking of teaming Jack Reacher up with this type of character, putting him in this sort of like cyber attack world? It must have been fun to play with Jack Reacher being teamed up with someone like, an IT manager.
Absolutely, yeah, it really was fun. And, I got to, I know it can be a danger, but, I got to really like Rusty. I thought he was, in my mind, he was a really nice guy. And so the way it all unfolded was, it kind of ties into a question that we get quite often, which is about research for the book. How do we go about researching books? And for me, in my mind, I see research as happening in two ways. There's a kind of forward-looking research, which is where you say to yourself, here's a subject, or here's a place, or here's a technology that I need to know about. So you go out and find out about that information. But I don't tend to do too much of that. What I tend to do is what I would call more like retrospective research, in that I'm a very curious person. I'm always reading about all kinds of different things. And for no particular reason, just anything that strikes me as interesting, I'll want to find out about. And all of that stuff then kind of sits at the back of your mind until it's needed, and then it springs out. So I'd read a lot of stuff about cyber crimes, about ransomware in particular, partly because my background, I worked in the telecommunication industry for 15 years. And during that time, with the move to internet, e-commerce, e-banking, all of that kind of stuff, a lot of what we needed to know about involved cybersecurity. So obviously it was a bit more rudimentary in those days because I've been out of that game for a long time. But it was something that I was interested in, so I'd read a lot about it. So there's an unbelievable amount of it going on at the moment, and it's very sneaky. It's insidious. People are doing it behind your back, and nobody knows until they're hit, and then they try to keep it quiet. So I had this in the back of my mind, and at the same time, I was thinking, for this new book, I would like, if Lee agrees, I'd like to try to put Reacher in an environment that he's uncomfortable with, and it's kind of hard to put him in a physical environment that he's uncomfortable with. So I was thinking more of a sort of intellectual environment. And, Reacher has become a little bit of a Luddite. He's not up with the technology. He's not, a computer user. He doesn't even own a cell phone. So I just had this vision one day, well, what would happen if Reacher arrived in a town where the computer systems that run everything have been locked down? Would Reacher even comprehend what that was about? How would he find out about it? And what would the impact be? And I thought, well, in a situation like that, you're probably going to have a lot of people wanting to get life back to normal as quickly as possible. You might have other people very happy with the disruption because they have, nefarious motives. So it would be fascinating on a couple of levels. One, Reacher trying to understand the technological background, but also trying to figure out the motivations of all the different players. So that's what I wanted to achieve. And I thought, well, how could you actually go about doing that? So, Reacher himself could never get up to speed with the technology quickly enough. So I figured, well, what you're going to need is for there to be somebody else, another person who has that level of expertise, which is what he contributes. And then Reacher contributes that, he's saving him and he can see, he can't see the technology, but he can see the bigger picture in terms of the bad actors at play. So I figured that out, and I was, I talked to Lee about the whole sort of cyber crime idea and Reacher arriving in this town that was locked down. So then we were talking one day, and Lee says to me, "So yeah, what I think we should do is have, another guy, a sympathetic character, maybe a bit dweeby, that is in trouble of some kind." So and for both of us, that was a key moment in this idea of writing together, because neither of us had written with anyone else before. So we both had a question in our minds, how was it going to work? So when we had that first moment, that meeting of minds, actually there were two meetings of minds, because we started the book in Nashville, where Reacher goes to listen to some music and steps in to help the struggling band that was being exploited by this unscrupulous nightclub owner. So we both like that sort of setup, because growing up watching the James Bond movies, how there was always a kind of dramatic action scene at the beginning that didn't necessarily relate enormously to the rest of the story, but it kind of set the scene for what you could expect from the characters and from the story. So we had great fun. I mean, he was actually involved with a band he was working with at the time. So I think, the whole music thing was fresh was at the forefront of his mind. So we had a lot of fun with that opening sequence. And then it moved into, Reacher arriving in another town, seeing Rusty Rutherford about to walk into danger and stepping in to set things right. And, the story unfolded from there. And as I say, it was a little uncomfortable for me, because I was used to knowing more about where the story was going to go. But Lee, was insistent that, no, this is the way we do it with Reacher. And, I think he was right.
Yeah, it's just such a, this new story just really does give people everything that they typically love about a Jack Reacher story. And one thing that always strikes me about Reacher that I want to get your thoughts on is, he's this loner. He's this very tough guy. He wants to be left alone, just, ride the bus and go to a diner by himself. But he always ends up helping someone. He always ends up doing the right thing, helping a stranger. And basically, as much of a loner as he is a very empathetic character. And to me, I think that's one of the reasons that he strikes such a chord with people. So what do you think about that? And basically, what do you think are some of the reasons why Reacher has endured for as long as he has?
Yeah, I think, your sort of, your question leads exactly to the answer, which is really, Reacher is a sort of timeless character. We know him in the 20th and the 21st century, but he goes back hundreds of years. He's essentially the latest incarnation of the knight errant, which is a character archetype, which is as old as storytelling itself. It goes, way back to Theseus, fighting the Minotaur. So, you've got this huge, long tradition that, for some reason, the human race, we love stories. We live an alternative life through stories, and we have a need for somebody who will, darkest hour, appear set everything right, and then walk away. And I think that that dynamic translates particularly well to the way we live today, because life is complicated. There are rules, there are laws. You have to keep a job, you have to have a house, all of these things which from time to time can feel overwhelming. So somebody who is separate from those things, who doesn't have a house, who doesn't have a job, who can, tear the head off some bad guy and not, miraculously not go to jail for the rest of his life, it is extremely cathartic. And, I don't think that, sometimes people focus in on the level of violence that Reacher is involved with. But really, that's just a sort of metaphorical thing. That's just, indicating the scale of the injustice that Reacher is fighting on our behalf as the reader.
So, what are some qualities? What are some Jack Reacher qualities that you think Lee has, that Lee Child has, and that maybe you have? Like, what would you say is the most Reacher-esque thing about each of you?
Well, it might not be something that people always see, but, a lot of the stuff that, Reacher is, he's simultaneously very pedantic, and he's very fascinated by knowledge and by trivia. And, that is, I'm certainly very pedantic to a fault. And, Lee is fascinated by facts and by trivia. I guarantee you that if you were to challenge Lee to 10 games of Trivial Pursuit, he would win 10 times. I've played him sometimes, and he's won the game before I've got a single one of those little, cheese-shaped things that you put in your counter. So, he loves all of that trivia. And like me, he's not necessarily pedantic, but he likes things to be precise. So I think a good example, I forget which book it is now, but there's a great example where Reacher objects to somebody talking about a spiral staircase, because a spiral is a two-dimensional shape. And so Reacher gets into this long, sort of musing about how they shouldn't be called spiral staircases, they should be called helical staircases, because a helix is the three-dimensional version of a spiral. And so, that kind of thing comes directly from Lee. And, things like Reacher's fascination with prime numbers, things like that. Lee will latch onto a certain topic, and then he will learn everything that there is to know about it in the world. And I think that is reflected in Reacher as well. And also his ability to draw conclusions. There are some great examples. If you think of the book One Shot, where the beginning of the book goes sort of step by step through the assassin arriving in the parking garage and taking aim at the civilians and shooting. You later learn that what you thought you saw was actually completely different. But he doesn't cheat. He shows every aspect, and he lays it out in a particular way. If you look at it from that side, you see a certain picture. But Reacher looks at it from the other side and sees something completely different. And I think that is both satisfying because, as a reader, you don't feel cheated because all of the facts were there. They were there for you to see. If you had just looked at them the same way Reacher had looked at them, you would have seen that picture. So you feel that it's completely legitimate. But at the same time, it's kind of surprising and thrilling because who knew that other picture was there, and it was there all along. So, that ability to draw conclusions, I think, is something that, if ever I'm confused about something or I can't figure something out, I'll call him up and, we always figure it out because he has that ability to look at things from other angles and see things that people don't see.
Great. So, last Reacher-specific thing that I wanted to ask is, obviously the way we've been living the last year is very different than we ever have been. People are, quarantines, very separate. How do you think Jack Reacher would have been handling living in these times? Would he even notice that there is a quarantine going on? Would it have affected his day-to-day?
Well, in terms of his day-to-day, it probably wouldn't have affected him hugely because, he's he likes to be on his own. So quarantining or isolating wouldn't be a big issue. But yeah, he absolutely would have noticed, because one of the things about Reacher is he is incredibly observant. That's one of the reasons that he's able to solve the puzzles that he solved. So he would absolutely understand what was happening. I think that he would be a little confused about why some people struggle with the idea of being isolated, because he likes being isolated. So he would think, well, what's the big deal? And, he always has this attitude of, bad things happen, get over it. So I don't think he'd have much tolerance for people, you hear a lot of people complaining about, oh my God, I've got to wear a mask, it's infringing on my rights. I could imagine Reacher turning around and saying, listen, we're not asking you to storm Omaha Beach. This is a pretty small inconvenience. So just, shut up and get over it. I don't think it would affect him enormously, and I think he would have a certain amount of difficulty understanding some other people's responses to it.
That is great to hear. I wish we had Reacher out here right now, pushing that message. So the book is out, the Sentinel is out. What are you and Lee hoping that readers take away from this newest Jack Reacher book?
Well, but that is honestly a little bit of a delicate question, because this is the first time we've written it together. Lee has this incredible legacy of 24 Reacher books. So of course, I bet he wants readers to be absolutely delighted with the book. But I think if there was any difference, I would be hoping people were liking it, just as much or maybe even more than his other books. So I'm a little biased, since this is my first time out of the traps with Reacher. So I'm hoping that people love it. I'm hoping they like it for all the same reasons that they like all the other Reacher books. And if at the end of the day they like it that little bit more, I would be delighted.
That's great. Hopefully you'll hear this is everyone's favorite one yet. And
absolutely.
So last thing on our show on Books Connect Us, we always like to get some book recommendations from the authors. So after people, of course, have picked up the Sentinel, they've read the Sentinel, is there something else maybe that you've read recently that you would recommend to our listeners?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things about writing is that you don't get as much chance to read as you might like, which is always disappointing. So I take every opportunity that I can. And there's a few things that I've read recently that really stand out. One of them, I typically go more in, when I'm writing, I somehow sort of veer into nonfiction mode. So a lot of what I've read recently has been nonfiction. But one novel that stands out to me that I've read recently is by a friend of mine called Sean Cosby. It's a book called Blacktop Wasteland. I don't know if you've come across that one, but it's phenomenal. It's about a legendary getaway driver. In his youth, he was known as the best getaway driver in 3 states, in the area in the South where he lived. And like a lot of people, he tried to get away from his past. He tried to shake off the problems that had brought him, and he tried to go straight. But in the book, you find him being dragged back into that old life, but not because he is greedy or because he wants to be able to buy, faster cars or nicer watches or anything. It's because of his background. He is constantly struggling to escape from poverty, to support his kids, to support his mother, and also his own business. He owns an auto body shop, which is in trouble financially. So, he's doing these things to survive. And really, it's a tragic book, because this is somebody who's forced to do stuff that he knows isn't right, but he doesn't have a choice, which I think is really interesting as a reader, because it raises those kind of moral issues about right and wrong. It's a really thrilling book. It's got some great action scenes. A lot of them surrounding cars as well, which is actually quite hard to write. I don't know if I could do that. So there's some great scenes in there in terms of action and suspense. And also it raises a lot of hard questions. It makes you think about identity. Who are you as a person? What is your role? what are your responsibilities, what is needed and demanded from you as a citizen, as a father, as a son. So all in all, it's a complex book. It's a fantastic read, and certainly one that I would recommend.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
great pick.
it's a great book. And then the other book, I'm only halfway through because it only just came out. But one of my favorite contemporary historians is Ben Macintyre. He typically writes about the Second World War. I've read all of his Second World War books, and his latest book is called Agent Sonia, and this time he verges more toward the Cold War. And he writes history that is more dramatic and more exciting than most thrillers, most novels, because he picks the most fantastic subjects, he uncovers the most fascinating details, and then he presents it in a just enthralling way. And Agent Sonia tells the story of a woman who appears to be just a regular, unassuming housewife living after World War II in a picturesque Cotswold village in England, with a husband who has a regular job, who just seem like totally ordinary people. But what no one in the village knows is that she is actually a high-level Soviet spy master. She's evaded attempts by the Germans, by the the Americans, by the British to capture her, and she is running this high-level espionage network throughout Europe, which actually sets the stage for the Soviet Union being able to build their first atomic bomb and enter the nuclear era and usher in the Cold War. So, it's just an absolutely wonderful book to read because that you can't believe that it's true, and yet it is. And the way that Ben Macintyre brings that kind of history to life is tremendous, I think.
Yeah, wow, those are great picks, and they're definitely great picks for people who are already fans of a Jack Reacher type book. These sound like incredibly real life thrillers.
Absolutely, they're a real extension. If you like the fictional world that Reacher lives in, then you're going to love the real life world that Ben Macintyre talks about. He's written other books to do with spying during the Second World War, to do with the creation of the SAS, the British Special Forces Unit, and all of his books, without exception, are meticulously researched and written in a way that all of the same adjectives that you hear used about thrillers, couldn't put down, couldn't stop turning the pages. These apply to these books. So, I would challenge anybody, you come across people who say that they don't like history. I would challenge anybody who thinks that to pick up any of Ben Macintyre's books, and I guarantee within 10 pages they're going to change their mind.
Well, thank you. You've given our listeners a lot of great recommendations. And of course, the first thing they should do, though, is pick up The Sentinel, the new Jack Reacher novel by Lee Child, and our guest today, Andrew Child. Thank you. Thanks so much for being on the show. This was really fun.
Thanks so much, Pat, and thanks for the great questions. You made it easy.
Thank you. I will make sure to include that as our ending. Thanks so much.
And now, here's an exclusive excerpt from the audiobook, courtesy of Penguin Random House Audio.
Music first, Reacher decided. He knew there was no shortage of venues in Nashville, but he wanted a particular kind of place. Somewhere worn, with some history, where Blind Blake could have played back in the day. Howlin' Wolf, even. Certainly nowhere new, or gentrified, or gussied up. The only question was how to find a place like that. The lights were still on in the bus depot, and a handful of people were still working or waiting or just keeping themselves off the street. Some of them were bound to be local. Maybe all of them were. Reacher could have asked for directions, but he didn't go in. He preferred to navigate by instinct. He knew cities. He could read their shape and flow like a sailor can sense the direction of the coming waves. His gut told him to go north. So he set off across a broad triangular intersection and onto a vacant lot strewn with rubble. The heavy odor of diesel and cigarettes faded behind him, and his shadow grew longer in front as he walked. It led the way to rows of narrow parallel streets lined with similar brick buildings, stained with soot. It felt industrial, but decayed and hollow. Reacher didn't know what kinds of businesses had thrived in Nashville's past, but whatever had been made or sold or stored, it had clearly happened around there, and it clearly wasn't happening anymore. The structures were all that remained. And not for much longer, Reacher thought. Either money would flow in and shore them up, or they'd collapse. Reacher stepped off the crumbling sidewalk and continued down the center of the street. He figured he'd give it another 2 blocks, 3 at the most. If he hadn't found anything good by then, he'd strike out to the right toward the river. He passed a place that sold part-worn tires, a warehouse that a charity was using to store donated furniture. Then, as he crossed the next street, he picked up the rumble of a bass guitar and the thunder of drums. The sound was coming from a building in the center of the block. It didn't look promising. There were no windows, no signage, just a thin strip of yellow light escaping from beneath a single wooden door. Reacher didn't like places with too few potential exits, so he was inclined to keep walking. But as he drew level, the door opened. 2 guys, maybe in their late 20s with sleeveless T-shirts and a smattering of anemic tattoos, stumbled out onto the sidewalk. Reacher moved to avoid them, and at the same moment, a guitar began to wail from inside. Reacher paused. The riff was good. It built and swelled and soared, and just as it seemed to be done and its final note was dying away, a woman's voice took over. It was mournful, desperate, agonizing, like a conduit to a world of the deepest imaginable sorrow. Reacher couldn't resist. He stepped across the threshold. The air inside smelled of beer and sweat, and the space was much shallower front to back than Reacher had expected. It was also wider, effectively creating 2 separate areas with a dead zone down the middle. The right-hand side was for the music lovers. There were a couple dozen that night, some standing, some dancing, some doing a bit of both. The stage was beyond them, against the far wall, taking up the full depth of the room. It was low, built out of beer crates with some kind of wooden sheeting nailed across the top. There was a modest speaker stack at each side, and a pair of metal bars hanging from the ceiling to hold the lights. The singer was front and center. She seemed tiny to Reacher, 5 feet tall at the most, and as thin as a needle. Her hair was in a perfect blonde bob that shone so brightly Reacher wondered if it was a wig. The guitar player was to her left, nearest the door. The bassist mirrored him on her right. They both had wild curly hair and high, sharp cheekbones, and looked so alike they could have been twins. Certainly brothers. The drummer was there too, pounding out the beat, but the shadow at the back of the stage was too deep for Reacher to see her clearly.
Thank you for listening to Books Connect Us. For more great book recommendations and information about your favorite authors, feel free to follow Penguin Random House on social media or visit penguinrandomhouse.com. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, go ahead and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it helps more listeners to find our show. This podcast is produced by Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. I've been Erin Leaf, and until next time, this has been Books Connect Us.